morning, which is that the Russian spies have been at it overnight, unfortunately, and buggered our AV system. They will do anything, these people, to disrupt democracy. So we're going to be, there's two parts of conclusions from that. We're going to try and be a bit louder than normal. You're not allowed to be the normal Resolution Foundation heckling audience, otherwise no one's going to hear anything. Even if they say ludicrous things, minimal heckling is the order of the day. Well, we're here to talk about the NHS, but obviously it's quite a difficult time in politics. There's difficult decisions out there, there are big questions being answered. Can Donald Trump denuclearise the Korean Peninsula? Can the European Union denuclearise Donald Trump's trade war? Can Theresa May get out of bed in the morning to try and deal with Brexit every day? And slightly more importantly for today's conversation, how shall we fund our national religion, the National Health Service? So that is the question we are trying to answer today in a new report we've published. We're going to kick today off shortly by Matthew Whittaker, our Deputy Director, giving you a summary presentation of that report, setting out the scale of the challenge and some of the options for funding it. And then we've got the right panel to give us their views on how we fund it. Everybody in government has already managed to brief to the papers how they want to fund it. So we've got everybody else here. Sarah Wollaston is going to kick us off with, who is the chair of the Health Select Committee and has been holding everybody's feet to the fire on health more broadly over recent years. Jonathan Ashworth, who is the Labour Party's Shadow Health Secretary, is then going to give us his take, and then Ben Page, who runs Ipsos MORI, is going to tell us the really depressing stuff about what the punters actually think, and then we'll have a Q&A if everybody's voice boxes are still holding up. Matthew, you're going to come and give us your presentation?
Thanks, Torsten. Good morning, everyone. Now, unless you've been living under a rock for the last few weeks or just binge watching Love Island, you'll know two things about the health service. One, it's under a lot of pressure, and two, it sounds like the government's going to do something about that with something of a 70th birthday present in the next couple of weeks or so. So I'm not going to spend very long this morning talking about that. Instead, I'm going to major on how the government might actually get into raising some of the funds that it might need in order to plug the funding gap within the NHS. Obviously the full paper does get into that, so you should go and read that as soon as you leave this room. Please download it. Maybe even download it sooner if it gets a bit boring up here. But go and read that, and I'm just going to take you through very quickly the how rather than the what and the why. But because I am a stickler for completeness, a quick word on the what, which is that the NHS is approaching its 70th birthday. What sort of shape is it in? Well, certainly it's a very different beast from the one that was born back in 1948. So the chart here is showing you the share of GDP that the government puts into health spending over the period of the NHS's life. And what you've got is that from around about 3% of GDP going towards health spending back in the early years of the NHS, we're now up above 7%. So in relative terms, the size of the health service, the size of health spending in the UK has more than doubled. And yet, despite being up above 7% now, public concern about what's going on in the NHS and hospitals is as high now as it was at the turn of the millennium, when we're only spending 5% of GDP on health. So we've got lots of concern, even though we're spending more and more on the NHS. And of course, the reason is fairly clear from the chart there, which is that over the last 10 or 15 years or so, things have flatlined, if not got a bit worse. So the share of GDP being spent on health actually has fallen a little bit over the last decade or so. And that's tricky in the NHS because it's hard to stand still given the demographics, given the fact that we're moving into new treatments and dealing with new technology all the time. So that's why many of the metrics within the NHS have started to deteriorate over the last few years, and people are becoming concerned. And just to give you a bit more context on the sort of spending settlement over the last decade or so, these pink lines are just showing you the average annual increase in real term spending in each of the 7 decades. Shown here, and what you've got there on the right hand side is that in the current decade we're on course for growth of just 1.1% a year on average, which is the lowest of any of the decades in the NHS's history. So things clearly are very tight, and if you were to add population growth into this and adjust for that, then the lines would drop lower and actually would be close to zero over the last decade or so. So it has been a tough time for the NHS. So with that in mind, we have had a lot of speculation that the government is going to put some more money into the NHS, that there will be a 70th birthday present coming up on the 5th of July. And the question then is how much? And so the chart here is just showing you the cash amount of increases in each of the next 4 years that would be associated with targeting different levels of real term rises. So from 2% on the left-hand side through to 4.5% a year growth on the right-hand side there. And if you focus on the final year, 22-23, which is the final year of the Parliament, that means a range of between 10 billion and 26 billion pounds extra in that year spending on the NHS. And the debate within Parliament, within the government rather, at the moment seems to be between the Treasury, who favour capping the increase at something like 2.5%, which would be around about 13 billion, and the Health Secretary, who wants a return to those historical rates of growth of about 4%, which would be 23 billion. And on the basis that even Kim and Trump can sit down and break bread, we think there is a deal to be struck. And so we, for illustrative purposes, are going somewhere in between the two. So I've highlighted there in red, around about 20 billion is the figure that we are using for illustration today. Obviously, we don't know what the final figure will be. So that's the easy stuff. What about the hard stuff? Where do we actually get this money from? Well, I think inevitably we're going to see a bit more borrowing, not least because the chart here is showing you public sector net borrowing as a share of GDP, and the projection that we had at the spring budget taking us through to the end of this Parliament. And what you see very clearly is that we're back in more what you might call normal territory on the deficit. So things have definitely eased compared to where they were 5-10 years ago. And the Chancellor himself, his fiscal mandate is to be below roughly the 2% line on this chart. And he's well on course to deliver that at the moment. So he's got a fair amount of fiscal headroom, something like 15 billion in 2021, and growing a bit more over the next few years. So there's a bit of room there, and the quote on the right-hand side, which is his from the spring statement, implies very heavily that if the public finances continue to behave as we go into the autumn budget, that he's prepared to spend a bit of this headroom on various things, but I'm sure health would be one of those. So I think we'll get some extra borrowing to fund some of this, let's say 20 billion, but I don't think it will all be borrowing. If we put the 4% a year rise onto this chart, then what you actually get is that he gets very close to breaking his fiscal mandate. And I think more troublingly for him, we're not seeing a reduction in the deficit anymore, and the medium-term objective of returning to an overall surplus as soon as possible in the next Parliament just looks like it's not possible on that trajectory. Now, many people would say 2% deficit a year is sustainable, and that's an argument you can have, but clearly there are trade-offs, and one of the trade-offs here is that if you did follow this route, then we would not be lowering the debt to GDP ratio at anything like the pace that the current government wants. So, in the vein that we are not looking this morning at what should we do, but instead we're looking at what's likely to happen, then I think it's much more likely that the Chancellor, again, will split the difference on this, and of that 20 billion, maybe borrow 10 billion. Maybe that means there's 10 billion left over. Probably not spending cuts, because we've already cut things very, very sharply. There's not much more we can do on welfare, not much more we can do on other public services. So that means around about 10 billion of tax rises. That feels fairly inevitable that that's the sort of ballpark we're talking about. And obviously that's difficult. So which tax rises should we be looking at? Again, there's a difference between should and will, and I think one of the main areas of tax that has been talked about is national insurance rises. Not least because this is what Gordon Brown did in 2003. And back then, it was successful, it ended up being popular. And it's popular again now. Ben will tell you a bit more later, and he'll have more nuanced figures, but a recent survey did show that 4/5 of people said that they would be prepared to support a 1p increase in national insurance if all of that money was guaranteed to go to the health service. So there is some public support out there for this kind of move. And it's progressive as well. So the chart here is showing you a 1p increase in employee and self-employed tax, how that is then distributed across the households from the poorest 10% on the left-hand side there to the richest 10% on the right-hand side. And the blue bars are showing you the cash loss that those households would make as a result of the tax rise, and the gold line is showing you as a proportion of their income. And what's very clear is that of this roughly £6 billion that would be raised through this move, the vast majority is coming from households in the top half of the income distribution. So it's progressive. But the big drawback with NICS is that it doesn't apply to people over state pension age. So actually the red bars here are showing you where the money's coming from across the age distribution, and what you see obviously is that it's all coming from the working age population. Now with something specific around NHS, that feels a bit problematic given that it is those older age groups who, certainly in the near to medium term, will be the heaviest users of healthcare services. So that doesn't feel like it's particularly generationally fair. And I think practically, from the government's perspective, the probably bigger barrier is that it's very hard to imagine how you get this through Parliament. We know the parliamentary numbers are tight for the government. None of the opposition parties have talked about supporting this kind of move, so the government would be reliant on discipline within its own ranks, and it wouldn't take very many members not agreeing with the government for this to fall foul. So I think it's a high-risk strategy and therefore one that's less likely. If one of the big problems with NICS is that it's not applicable to people over state pension age, then one obvious place you could go to is to extend it to people over state pension age, and this is obviously what we looked at in the Intergenerational Commission. And this would raise about £2.5 billion, we reckon, by 2022-23. That's NICS on earnings for those above state pension age, but also NICS with a higher threshold and a lower rate on private pension income. Now that gets you around the generational problem, but it doesn't get you around the voting problem. So for practical reasons, again, this is another tricky one, I think. What about all the other tax rises that are out there? Income tax. Actually, if you put a penny on income tax, it raises a bit more than the national insurance. It's a little bit more progressive, and it doesn't have the generational problem. But again, the practical issue of getting it through Parliament is the tricky one. I think the government might be helped here because the Lib Dems manifesto has a pledge of an income tax rise, and we've had income tax rises in Scotland, so the SNP might not be in a position to oppose rises south of the border. But again, it comes down to the discipline within the Conservative Party, and again, that's a sort of fairly high-risk strategy, I would suggest. So it's probably an option, but it's a difficult one. Perhaps more likely on income tax, and indeed on NICS, is just to have a return to the old days of fiscal drag. So the Conservative manifesto has the pledge in it to raise the personal allowance to £12,500 and to raise the higher rate threshold to £50,000 by the end of this Parliament. And that's not been funded yet, and that's an expensive pledge, and it's a regressive pledge. But it's probably one that the government can't turn its back on, having got into difficulty in the last Parliament abandoning a manifesto pledge. So let's assume they do deliver it. Actually, you could then still come out in a net position of raising money if, once you reach those thresholds, in the final 2 years of the Parliament, you then freeze them. And you also freeze the national insurance threshold. That would raise about £3.7 billion as shown here. It's much less visible and therefore, I think, less controversial and therefore more likely to have the Conservative members voting for it. But as the chart shows, it is less straightforwardly progressive than the other measures. So again, pros and cons. I think the most straightforward measure to get through Parliament would be just to reverse the corporation tax cuts that are already in line for 2020. So our corporation tax is at 19%, it's due to drop to 17% in April 2020. That's going to cost us £5.7 billion, which is roughly double what we thought it was going to cost when George Osborne initially announced the policy. So I think the government's within its rights to say, well, things have changed, so we need to look at this again. And we have Labour and the Lib Dems in their manifestos pledging to increase corporation tax, so on this particular measure you would think that they would have to vote with the government. So this would feel like something that could be got through. But ultimately it's a tax rise, and so you still need to think through where the incidence lies and how that plays out. And then wealth tax reform is the other major area, which I won't say very much about today because for reasons of time and because there's a lot to get into here. But I think there is scope here for raising some significant sums, and it would be generationally fair, but clearly exactly how you do it is very important, and again it would be, I think, controversial, and there would be questions about political appetite that we'd need to get into. So that's a real rattle through some of the different options, and I think it's pretty clear that there's no sort of clear winner. What can we conclude from all of that? Well, I think, first of all, I think we can and should expect an announcement of extra funding, that some of that will come from extra borrowing, and some of it will have to come from new tax rises. I think relying on that old favourite of a NICS rise is generationally unfair and very hard to pass through Parliament, so I would be surprised if we did end up going down that route. But all of the other options have this range of pros and cons. So actually our recommendation is that government should, not least for reasons of gaining public support and good public policy, actually undertake a consultation over the summer, looking at all of these different options in a bit more detail before actually providing a final way forward at the autumn budget, rather than just giving us a fait accompli on the 5th of July. And we then think that the final decision should be fully informed by the impact of the changes, both in terms of the progressivity across the income distribution, but also the impact across different generations. Alternatively, the members of our panel might have all of the answers up their sleeves, which they can give you next. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matt. reminded us of two true things in life, which is one, birthday presents are expensive, and two, there are no easy choices. So on the subject of no easy choices, Sarah?
Well, thank you, Matt, for a fantastic presentation. And I'd just like to throw in another complication. And that is that when the government talks about increasing NHS funding, what they often talk about is NHS England funding. And the first thing that I would like to add is that we need to look at the whole system. We can't look at NHS England in isolation. What we've seen in the past with the rises to NHS England funding is that that has come out of Health Education England funding, Public Health England funding. It's come out of capital, and there's a huge backlog of urgent capital spending required in the NHS. It's come at the expense of transformation funding to change the system. But very importantly, it doesn't include social care. So I'd just like to throw social care into the mix here, and also to throw into the mix, right at the centre of all this, the importance of prevention, investing in public health, which is the unsexy end, if you like, of health spending, because nobody ever knows if the government saved your life through public health. But of course that has been the great triumph of our age and why we're living so much longer. And I think first of all we should stop talking about that in gloomy terms. It is a great success we're living longer, but what we've seen over successive governments is a failure to properly plan for that. And it's not just the demographic change, it's the cost of new drugs. If you look at the rise in the drugs bill for the acute sector, if we look at what's happened in primary care, they've done rather better at managing those costs. But the cost of new technologies and innovation, the cost of dealing with multi-morbidity, people who are living with more than one long-term condition. This is something we absolutely have to plan for, but also to plan for social care and to invest in our workforce. So that's why I would say let's look at the whole system. Let's not just look at it now, but look at planning over the horizon, 10, 15 years ahead. Now, any of you who will have seen the excellent report out last week from the IFS, I agree with their assessment that 3.3% is a standstill position. So if the Treasury come forward with a 2.5% proposal and think that's going to be welcomed as a great success, they better start thinking again right now, because we know that what's needed in the long term, if we're not going to have standstill but actually look at making some improvements that we want, very necessary improvements around, for example, mental health resourcing, we're looking at least 4% long term. With a bit of earlier front-loading catch-up to actually address what has been the longest sustained period of a squeeze in the NHS's history, running in the face of a massive increase in demand. So that's where we are. The other thing I'd like to just add into this is that we often hear people talking about investing in the NHS as somehow a bottomless pit. I think the data that we saw from Matt, people are somehow still unhappy with what they get. Actually, no, people really are happy with the NHS. They value it enormously. And we need to keep being out there making the case for how this is a positive thing when we invest in the NHS, the benefits that that has for our economy. And we sometimes don't do enough of that, talking about the positive case for further investment. And we all know it's difficult. We all know over past decades, a lot of this was achieved by shifting it from defence budgets and so forth, but we can't do that anymore. We're at the limit of what we can squeeze from other departments. Neither do I think we should pretend that all the problems in the NHS are about privatisation. The Health Committee published our report yesterday looking at integrated care and all the various systems and acronym spaghetti we create in the NHS for talking about system reform. And we don't feel that it's reasonable to say that all of the problems are around privatisation in the health service. I just think we should try and scotch that myth. What we need to do is focus on the positive case for investing in health, social care and public health as a whole system in the long term. And then come back to principles. And just a word of apology here. because the Health and Social Care Committee, alongside the Housing, Communities and Local Government Committee, are about to publish a report in what we think would be the options for funding. I just need to be very clear, I'm just speaking in a personal capacity in what I say, not trying to pre-announce what the committees may or may not agree. But one thing we did do is we worked with a citizens' assembly. And for those who are unfamiliar with it, citizens' assemblies are like a larger version of a citizens' jury. And I think it is a very good way of engaging with public opinion and establishing principles. So we'll be publishing their findings alongside our committee reports. And as I say, I can't pre-announce what the committees may agree. But I'd like to talk on a personal level about the principles that I think are important. And I think that the principle has to be around fairness. And I think intergenerational fairness has to be at the root of that. If we can't go out there and make the case for why it has to be fair, I'm afraid we're not going to persuade anyone of any of this. And just looking at the headlines in the Times today, yes, some of this may come out of borrowing, but it can't all come out of borrowing. Ultimately, somebody's going to have to pay for it. And the answer is, how should we spread that fairly? And of course, the other problem we have is Brexit. I have never believed that there's going to be some mythical 350 million a week premium from all of this nonsense. In fact, we may end up, I think it's very likely, particularly if we end up with a hard Brexit, that we'll be really struggling to find some of the extra resources here. So I think we need to be realistic with people that there are going to be tax rises coming over the horizon, and the principle, in my mind, has to be how we spread that fairly, including over the generations. And I'm very interested to hear what your views are on the presentation you've heard today. And that's not a cop-out, it's simply because I have to be careful not to appear to say what the committees are agreeing. But thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Jonathan.
Okay, I'll go to the lectern. Thank you very much, Torsten. I can start by saying it's a pleasure to be here at the Resolution Foundation, and if I may just pay tribute to the Resolution Foundation briefly, because I think your rigour and analysis over various different thorny policy issues in recent years, putting the economic concerns of ordinary working people at the heart of policy making like never before. So I think the Resolution Foundation deserves huge praise and tribute for all the work you've done in recent years. Now, my opposite number, Jeremy Hunt, I think, has considerably raised expectations around this so-called birthday present for the NHS later this month, telling us to expect significant investment. I'm not going to rehearse all the pressures that the NHS is facing, as it's already been touched upon. And indeed, I agree with Sarah, when we engage in this debate, we shouldn't just talk about NHS England spend, we should talk about public health, the training budgets, the capital budgets as well. But if I may, can I just start with a broad observation and then sort of outline, if you like, my 5 tests, if you like, or the 5 things I would be looking for in this upcoming settlement for the NHS. And it is clear, of course, we do need that long-term settlement. And we're told that this plan is imminent. But I'm struck by the world of difference between what is happening today and the way in which a long-term plan was put in place by the Labour government in 2002. 17 years ago, Gordon Brown tasked Derek Wanless with conducting a comprehensive analysis of the future health needs of the country and the options for funding it. It was detailed, it was an exacting piece of research conducted over a year or so. And based on that in-depth analysis, Gordon Brown introduced a specific and sustainable tax increase for the NHS. Not hypothecation, but a tax increase for a purpose clearly understood and endorsed by the public. It helped deliver record investment tied to modernisation, to tackle waiting lists and expand capacity, and it culminated in some of the lowest waiting times and highest satisfaction ratings. And it all began as a thorough, detailed process run by the Treasury, not hindered by it. I don't think the same can be said today. And my worry is that in the next couple of weeks we'll get a half-baked panic settlement that fails to satisfy expectations. So let me just outline what I will be looking for when the government announced their plan. First, the funding test. Now, Labour's commitment is to a fully funded NHS and social care service to fulfil the standards of care obligations enshrined in the NHS Constitution and to improve the quality of care for the future. Our plan last year would have involved us spending nearly 9 billion extra for health and social care this year, paid for by fair increases in taxation on the wealthiest in society. That would amount to more than a 5% increase in the first year of a Labour government, paid for by asking the top 5% to pay more in income tax, increase taxation on private medical insurance, and increase corporation tax. And because our commitment as a Labour Party is to a fully funded NHS, we would establish an OBR-style process to advise us on funding needs for the future. So my first test is whether the government are prepared to take the fair decisions on taxation, to fully fund our NHS and public social care for the long term, increase spending by nearly 9 billion extra in the first year, and whether increase spending by nearly 9 billion in the first year. My second test is on staffing. We know we have a vacancy gap of 100,000, including shortages of more than 40,000 nurses and midwives, 11,000 doctors. We know that community nurses, mental health nurses, learning disability nurses have all fallen since 2010. We know, despite government efforts, that GP numbers are going down as well, and we know that the IFS Health Foundation report predicted we'll be short of 170,000 nurses and 70,000 doctors over the coming years. And with respect to social care, the IFS suggests a massive 458,000 additional staff will be needed by 2033-34. So a credible plan to deliver the staff our NHS and social care sector need will be a key test of the government's settlement in the coming weeks. We would bring back the training bursary for nurses and allied health professionals as a start, and we would immediately drop, and we're calling on the Prime Minister to immediately drop, the so-called hostile environment visa regime, which is currently denying so many hospitals access to the best international clinical staff. Our third test is on the way that care would be delivered. We know that we have a growing population, and we all know that as we live longer, the disease burden our health and social care sector faces changes as well. Already, long-term health conditions take around 70% of the health services budget, and the future ability of the NHS to deliver whole-person care demands greater integration and coordination between community care, primary care, mental health services, social care and the acute sector. Yet the current NHS landscape, created by the 2012 Health and Social Care Act, has delivered a fragmented, wasteful mess. An organisational no man's land, with structures not fit for purpose, as Alan Milburn said last week. But when faced with the demographic changes, and when we need to help people manage long-term conditions like diabetes, we should consolidate, not fragment. And for the Labour Party, we believe that healthcare should be delivered not on the basis of markets, but on partnership and planning. I appreciate the point Sarah makes about privatisation, but these structures have allowed a situation where NHS expenditure on private health providers has gone up to 9 billion in the last year. So our third test is whether the government will scrap the Health and Social Care Act, end fragmentation, end the so-called purchaser provider split, end the privatisation, and instead move towards genuine integration, coordination, planning and partnership, publicly administered and provided. Yesterday, I revealed that the NHS is relying on decades-old medical equipment, often long past its replacement date. We've already heard about the backlog in repairs that hospitals face. It's around 5 billion, thanks to years of capital to revenue funding shifts. But over the coming years as well, artificial intelligence, bespoke nutrition, robotics, digital health technologies, the Internet of Things, where 50 billion devices will be connected in the next 25 years, will all offer huge opportunities for improving health outcomes in the future too. So Labour would invest an extra 10 billion in capital in the NHS. We would expand R&D investment across the board by 1.3 billion during the first 2 years of a Labour government. And to support the spread and adoption of innovation, we would increase funding for the academic health sciences network. So our fourth test is whether the government will sufficiently invest in the infrastructure of our NHS, renew existing equipment, clear the multi-billion pound backlog of repairs, ensure we access the most innovative technologies of the future, and I would argue it's time to ban these capital to revenue transfers in the NHS, certainly in the short term at least. And finally, on health inequalities, it should shame us as a society that advances in life expectancies have begun to stall, that in some of the very poorest areas it's going backwards, that there is a difference in life expectancy between the place of birth, around 9 years, depending on if you're born in the poorest areas compared to the most well-heeled areas. In recent years, we've seen huge admissions to hospital for malnutrition, The mortality rate for socially excluded groups, such as rough sleepers or those engaged in substance misuse, is around 8 times higher for men and 12 times higher for women. Child poverty is on the increase, and we know there's a correlation between poverty, deprivation, and relatively poor child health outcomes. So an overarching strategy for tackling the wider determinants of poor health and well-being is our final test. That means measures to improve the quality of air we breathe and the standards of housing many live in. It means rather than cutting substance misuse services by 42 million, like we've seen in the last year, it means offering real support. It means an all-out mission to improve the health and well-being of every child. I believe we're starting with tackling the childhood obesity crisis through bold measures, such as banning the advertising of junk food on family TV. And it means expanding, not cutting, public health budgets, an early years provision too. So the NHS stands at a critical juncture. In this, the 70th anniversary of the NHS, the Health Secretary has a chance to reset the trajectory of the last 8 years. A quick fix or fudge won't do. We need a long-term plan for our NHS and social care sector. I believe my party can offer that. Jeremy Hunt has raised expectations hugely. Let's see if he can deliver.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. As well as lots of other good things, that was a reminder that no Labour politician should ever be caught out without 5 tests. It's like crucial. It is crucial
6
to
tests
getting
now, Brexit. 6
There's
tests.
6 on
tests.
Brexit. Oh, who did?
I'm traditional.
Did they not get the memo? It's always
I'm
5
old
tests.
style.
Right. Okay. Ben.
So in terms of the dear old public, I mean, on the face of it, all of this is a slam dunk. You've got 3/4 of the public who say the NHS is so important, it must be maintained at almost whatever cost. And we've polled that since before the first national insurance rise was announced at the beginning of the century, and the number has never changed. So a real sense that people want to put money into it. Absolute agreement, pretty much, that they want it funded through general taxation, free at the point of use. Relatively little interest in moving to any sort of European insurance scheme. So that's pretty clear. We've got high concern, as Matt noted, although as an older person in the room, and not quite as old as some members of the audience, but I'm 53, it's interesting in terms of anxiety, there you go Nick, in terms of anxiety about the NHS, it's much lower at the moment than, say, unemployment was in the early 1980s, when 87% of people cited that as a big problem facing the country. So you've got around half mentioning the NHS, but that is much lower than some other issues. We aren't, and I don't think we are yet at crisis. Satisfaction has held up. It's slipped back a bit, but it's still higher than it was in the 1990s. And you know, we're not quite there yet. So the slam dunk isn't perhaps quite as clear as we might have thought, and I can see why perhaps some politicians are cautious. Social care, of course, is a disaster. And you know, there's massive unmet demand. We did a report for the LGA. It just shows huge hidden demand that isn't being spotted. But I think the interesting point here is the government is not on the hook over social care. And my advice to any Secretary of State who thinks about taking direct and personal responsibility for social care is do not ever do that. Because it's bad enough at the moment being responsible for what happens in hospitals up and down the country, let alone thinking you're now responsible for renting bedpans in every local authority in Britain. So don't do it. I'm not saying that it shouldn't happen, but I'm just saying politically it wouldn't be a very sensible thing to do. So in terms of polling and the public, we've asked the questions about how to fund the NHS, which everybody agrees needs to happen. And it does the answers you get very much depend on how it's framed. So you can see, if you just say, would you like to have a rise in income tax to pay more for the NHS, and you're asking about that with a range of other options, the most popular option is just taxing foreigners who use the NHS more. Yeah, that's great. Immigrants, make them pay more. So in that context, you get 40% favouring you get 40% favouring income tax rises. You get 53% favouring a national insurance rise. If you then say it's hypothecated, and you put a gun to their heads and say, if we don't do this, other services will have to be cut, or the NHS will have to not provide what you think it should, then it goes up to either 66% or even 80%. So the framing of how this is argued for is still very important. It's not, while in policy communities and in rooms like this it may seem straightforward, I'm not sure that it is. And a key challenge is going to be perceived competence to deliver this. I mean, perceived competence generally is a key issue in terms of who gets to be Prime Minister. It's never, the most honest person. It's always the most competent, and that is key. So even if you're offering milk and honey, do they believe that you're actually competent in terms of delivering it? So if I was going to be announcing this, I would be talking about new services rather than reform and reorganisation, because the public, while successive generations of politicians of all colours love to talk about reform, the public does not find it as exciting as they do, and they tend to think that more money is the answer. I would talk about new services. I would talk about efficiency, because 50% of people, while wanting to give the NHS billions more, also say that it often wastes money, and they are actually more likely to disagree than agree to believe that it's getting any better at being more efficient. And then in terms of where the money went, I would announce at least whatever actually happened. Of course, I'm talking about presentation, not what actually happens, but I would certainly announce accident and emergency, and interestingly, I would also focus on mental health, which has come second in a list of choices that the public have chosen from recently, and concern about mental health has doubled in the last year. Some of that is, of course, the royals talking about it, it's our culture is gradually shifting, and of course one of the challenges in all of this, the real changes that we need to make, even after we've put all this money in, may be as far away as ever, in the sense that, in terms of moving from an illness service to a wellness service, and investing the money we need to in prevention, the public, of course, puts public health right at the bottom of their list of priorities, which shows why you should never do what the public tell you in opinion polls. The end. Thank you. Well, you can't do that en masse, that's the problem.
We can't do it legally, even on a small amount. But anyway, right, okay, there's our take. Let's get your questions, answers, or if you want to have a punt on what's actually going to happen, then, particularly if it's a well-informed punt, or if the government's here wants to tell us, that's great too. Let's start with the question. You're going to have to bellow, but nicely.
Nick Bosanquet, Emeritus Professor of Health Policy at Imperial College, and I think the inventor of the whole debate about health funding and aggregate health funding. I was known as Mr. 2% in the 1980s. First, the good news that 4% was not the deliverable real funding over that long period, because there was such a zigzag pattern with boom and bust that somewhere near 2% was in fact the usable real funding over the period. I would caution that we don't need to go for 4%, but 2.5%, which is in fact 5% with the inflation impact, would be enough. That's 20% plus over 5 years. We've got to take much more notice of what the health service can really use effectively. Secondly, the problems of the post-Brown splurge in spending was that they led to two side effects. One was an excessive concentration on hospitals and a total destruction of initiative in primary care. At the beginning of the Brown splurge, 50% of medical students wanted to go into general practice. By the end, it was 0. I think it's about 5%. That is realistic reflection of how the destruction of initiative, which was a very powerful force in screening, cardiac, coronary heart disease programs, and integrated care in the 1980s and 90s, have gone. So the message I would give from sort of I can remember the 20th anniversary of the NHS. The happiest one was the 10th, by the way. There was a great love in them. But is that we must concentrate on Sarah's issues of prevention, public health, social care, and above all, primary care. We must have a 24/7 access service, because we've had the biggest boom in hospital attendance in the G7 and a lot of others, with a doubling of outpatient appointments. For what? What's been the outcome for that? Nobody knows. 60% rise in hospital admissions. In Scotland, no rise at all, and in Sweden, no rise at all. We've got to have an out-of-hospital system which actually deals with the ageing population. So there are some positives, but there's a danger that this will be the worst fiasco since the Dreadnought programme. Why was that a fiasco? Well, instead of building 8 dreadnoughts, we should have built 4 and 100 minesweepers and mine layers.
I didn't see this coming.
which
I did not see this
the
coming. I've been with you all the way, and then naval history started. That is enough. We're done on naval history.
Let us get a focused programme which starts with a realistic...
And does not have any minesweepers. So let's do Nick's question. So Nick's saying, look, Nick's a cheapskate and thinks you all want to splurge too much money, and he also thinks that Gordon Brown is to blame for everyone going to work in hospitals, not George Clooney, because that is peak ER years you're talking about, and I think it might have also. Why don't we start with that? So,
Well, I agree with the point about boom and bust, and if you give too much all in one go, you can end up wasting it rather than actually sort of reforming. You've got to plan ahead, think about how you're going to spend it. But I'm afraid I don't agree with you as Mr. 2%. I do think that unless we actually are prepared to invest more, the public are going to notice that we're going to have worsening services. But I absolutely agree with you on the shift to being more about community. But unfortunately, as we've heard from Ben, public health and social care don't win you any votes. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. It's absolutely where the evidence tells us we should go.
Jonathan?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously the NHS desperately needs more money, but you're right to raise concerns that it will all be sucked up into the acute sector, and it's actually why I think we have got to look again at some of the internal financing models. I mean, the sort of payment by results model, the sort of where you get a kind of, you know, you get more money for every click through the door, every click through the turnstile, is obviously sucks a lot of resource into the acute sector. And I think whether you go down the ACO route or some other route of investing or providing more capacity in primary and community care, you've got to change the system so that it's properly resourced in order to respond to some of these long-term conditions which we're now seeing more and more in society. Just sucking everything into the acute sector, I don't think is the way forward. And I think actually, my sense when I'm talking to hospital trust chief executives, a lot of them accept that now as well.
Ben, on your, because you're quite doom and gloomy on spending money on non-A&E related things. But
no, I'm not doom and gloom. It's just what the public sees as top of the list, but they see what's visible. And remember, only 40% of people even go near a hospital. They've got no idea of the complexity of the NHS and all of the things it covers, etc.
But is access to GPs not? I haven't looked at the data in the last year.
Satisfaction for the first time. Satisfaction of GPs is now starting to fall, and the survey we do of every GP as part of the deal they have with the BMA and DH is showing now real issues around access, and the challenge for anybody in government, even when you're pouring money in, where actually, Nick, I mean, you can argue about how a lot of the money, of course, went on pay and pension increases rather than actually changed to services, but satisfaction did demonstrably rise, 20-point rise in satisfaction of A&E, particularly with the 4-hour target. So there were clear, we can argue about how well it was spent, but the public, up until 2009, the biggest sustained rise in satisfaction with the NHS we've ever seen. But at the same time, you know, some real challenges, I guess, going forwards.
Great. Now there's a lady here at the front. Go ahead.
Hello. No one has mentioned accountable care organisations. Indeed, everything to do with a very important question of the amounts of money that are commandeered by the private sector as part of general expenditure by government on NHS is surely a huge question that has recently been the subject of a judicial review at the High Court. Would the panel please comment? Thank you.
What was your name?
Una Jane Winfield from Save Our Hospitals.
Save Our Hospitals, okay, very good. And everyone, let's have a question here as well.
Throughout the Welfare Reform Act 2012 and the Welfare Reform Act 2016, we lobbied all parties for a health impact assessment of the reforms to the benefit system. And we warned that if you increase debts and you actually lower incomes, you create mental health problems, not to mention other serious physical health problems. Recently, we noted that there had been unprecedented rise in infant deaths and an unprecedented lowering of the expectation of life. Is there not something to be done in the way of, as you were saying, prevention, but also calculating the cost that the Department of Work and Pensions never does of the health consequences of having a failed benefit system?
Great question. There's people from the Health Foundation here, I think, who want to answer your question over the next 10 years. There's a gentleman in the middle there. Go ahead. Tell us who you are as well.
Chief of Strategy. I just want to pick up on John Ashworth's point about the oneness of time funding to transformation, and ask whether that's something that Labour would look to do again. I note that the recent Health Select Committee report made recommendations and such similar to that. And if so, would Labour flesh out to a greater extent what that transformation might look like?
Okay. Well, let's get. We have, as all health conversations in the end end up back to squiggly diagrams and reform and others. So do you want to touch on accountable care organisations?
Yes.
How much change should we be delivering legislative change, or should we carry on doing our backdoor
Right,
changes?
well, first of all, could I encourage you to read the report that the Health Committee published yesterday? And what we feel is that there are so many acronyms in the NHS at the moment, and nobody knows what they mean. And we need to get back to saying, what do they deliver for the patient who's using care? And we know that allowing organisations to work more effectively, to join up and talk to each other and deliver care that is around an individual's, all of their needs, is the way we need to go in the NHS. And we do believe that trying to get rid of some of the hurdles that were put in the way of joining up as a result of the Health and Social Care Act is an important thing to do. And so we'd like to see those changes and proposals come from the bottom, if you like, rather than be imposed from the Department of Health. Let's ask the voluntary sector, let's ask local authorities, let's ask the NHS locally to say, what's getting in the way of you delivering better care for people? And let's ask them to start designing the legislation and see it from the other end of the telescope, see it from the patient's end of the telescope. We think, unfortunately, because of the choice of the term accountable care organisation, it's allowed people to somehow conflate that with some conspiracy to Americanise the NHS and see people charged for care. And we think that's a false premise. We don't agree that that's the case. We think, if anything, moving in this direction allows us to, if you like, row back on the internal market. But equally, we don't want to see us end up with the airless room of a monolithic provider. So I think that we have to be very careful that we don't frame this all as some conspiracy to privatise the NHS, because otherwise we miss an opportunity to actually allow organisations to work better together and to actually row back on some of the things that are getting in the way. But we think, because there has been this rather toxic debate about whether accountable care organisations are just an Americanisation, the government should publicly state that these are NHS bodies. They do need to be established in statute. So we think there's something in our report for all sides of this argument, that we do think that they should be clearly public bodies, but we don't agree that this is some conspiracy to Americanise the NHS. We think actually it's an opportunity and we should grasp that. But that requires people sometimes abandoning sort of firmly held sort of political views that it's all a conspiracy. We don't think it is.
Jonathan, is it a conspiracy, and what transformation would you want in exchange for your cash?
I mean, we have expressed in Parliament our opposition to the proposed accountable care organisations as they are currently suggested, because we have a concern that you're essentially or effectively bundling up billions of pounds worth of contracts. And we're concerned that you're bundling up billions of pounds worth of contracts, and because of the Landsey legislation, there is a risk that those contracts all go out to a private provider. Now, which is why, I mean, I didn't refer to ACOs in my remarks, but I did say, of course, we want to move to a system where there's greater integration, collaboration, partnership, but that should be for a public sector solution. Now, Sarah's report, I've seen the executive summary, but I've not read the whole report yet. It only came out yesterday. But I think Sarah's report is saying that they should be in the public sector. But my fear is that while the Health and Social Care Act is on the statute book, it becomes difficult to deliver that. And we know that some of these private sector companies are becoming increasingly aggressive in the courts. You know, the very infamous example is Virgin Care suing Surrey CCG, but there's other examples which haven't got the headlines as well. So we do have concerns, but we're not against the principle of bringing health providers in an area together, because we went from a more fragmented landscape, a more fragmented set of structures, when the whole world is moving to more consolidated sets of structures. So we do need to move away from this fragmentation. We agree with that, but it's how you get there.
And transformation for cash, return to minister.
Well, in the general election, we said that this money would go in because we wanted to bring waiting times down, but we also wanted to help hospitals deal with its delayed discharges of care, so we had targets for that as well. But that is why we also said the money would not only go into the NHS, it would also go into the social care sector. I think the public would expect the A&E targets, the 18-week targets to be met. They've become broadly acceptable to the public, and I think we should be aiming to get back there.
Right, let's get one more round of questions. Anita?
It's Torsten Health Foundation, and did some of the work on the report last week. I wanted to come back to the issue of tax and longer term, and Matt did a great analysis of some of the options over the next few years, and clearly pre-Brexit, and the uncertainty about the economic forecast, planning for the long term might be quite difficult at the moment. But the thing that stands out for me from the work that we did, and is the truism of 70 years of the NHS, is that for completely logical reasons, growing an ageing population, rising chronic disease, new technology, and the fact that as we get richer, we choose healthcare as one of the things that's important to us. This is not a short-term one-off problem. This is a structural issue. It is absolutely sensible to provide healthcare through a publicly funded system. If you want to do that for more than the next few years, there is a tax consequence to that. If we don't address that tax consequence, we cut things like benefits, which potentially make the health problem worse, not better. So my question, in a way, I mean, particularly to politicians, but also about the public, because I think the public are stupid, I mean, I think they get that, is actually, when are we at the point where we stop dealing with it as a short-term tactical issue, which is what has led to the up and down of money, and I would argue to some of the structural inefficiencies in the system, and when and how do we get to actually having the substantive conversation about, if you want good services, how do you most fairly pay for it? And do that transparently rather than another set of stealth taxes.
Okay, well, that's what's called the structural social democrat position, which is in the olden days. That was meant non-pejoratively.
Right.
In the olden days, if you were a lefty, then you wanted a bigger state because you wanted to do loads of new exciting stuff, like schools, for example. Nowadays, the structural social democrat is, oh God, the world's quite hard. Stuff that we already do is going to get more expensive and needs a bigger state as a percent of GDP. And so it's no longer a left or right. I want to do new stuff. I want to socialise a load and collectivise a load of new stuff. I just want to carry on doing what I'm doing. And because of the format the world we're in, that just means a higher tax to GDP ratio. So why don't we do one? Is that where are you a structural social democrat? And then where's the punters? You definitely.
Well, I think the public. What's interesting is to compare this issue and indeed the funding of social care, where we immediately start using words like death taxes. And one of the challenges is that this is an issue where the Labour Party, of course, founded the NHS and believes that this is a trump card for it in politics. When actually what's happened over pensions, you could argue that as a country we've sort of somehow come to an agreement that you pay more or you work longer or both, and that's it. And we've sort of done, and that's that the heat has gone from that. But the heat is still going to be here around the NHS for all sorts of reasons. So I think quite a lot of people would be happy to see it taken out. The question is, can it? But yes, I think that in theory the public buys that. Of course, a lot of people will argue that it's never going to be possible to have something as huge as this done in that way. But as a structural social democrat, I'll sign up. It would be popular with a lot of people.
Yeah, me too. I'm a structural social democrat. There we are.
It's the new party. The SSPs.
Hey, there we go. This has been a political failure over the years, because one person proposes to fix some of this, and it's denounced as a death tax. The next time round, it's denounced as dementia tax. Because although everybody agrees they want this fixed, actually when it comes to election time, and it means that they personally will have to pay more, when somebody else is promising that they won't and somebody else will be able to fix this, then I'm afraid that's where people cast their vote. And I can tell you now, as someone who knocked on doors during the last election, that it was like falling off a cliff, the announcement that older people's wealth would come into the equation in the way it did. And undoubtedly that is, in my view, what lost Theresa May her majority, for trying to put forward a proposal about how we fix social care. And I think the only way we're going to deal with this is by cross-party working. And also, if we look at what happened with pensions under Adair Turner, we know it is possible for this to happen, and we're never going to be able to fix this. We're going to be having exactly the same conversations around social care in 10 years' time, unless political parties agree that it needs to be fixed, and we've got to do it.
You an SSD?
I would describe myself as a socialist.
There's always one.
Okay.
In the Tony Crosslandite tradition.
They've lost the entire audience.
But I think the position that the Labour Party put forward in the 2017 election, where we were actually explicit about tax rises, it's quite unusual for a centre-left party in England to do that since 1992, when we were very burnt by it. We've always gone into elections with a sort of, we're going to fund this little bit extra here, but here's some waste that we found, and here's a tax on people who are very, 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 very unpopular, like bankers, to fund all our umpteen different proposals. But we actually did put forward tax rises in that general election, and I think, well, there's lots of analysis and counter-analysis about what really went on in that general election, but it's certainly true that Labour had a result that was unexpected at the start of that election campaign. I'll put it there for now, so we don't go off into a tangent. I agree that we have to resolve this issue of non-means tested social care. There's been umpteen reports over the last 8 years with different solutions for it, and we've not grasped the nettle on it. My party is consulting on it. We have a separate social care minister in our shadow cabinet, and Barbara Keeley is leading on that work. And but I agree we've got to resolve it. In terms of this sort of cross-party working, look, I've always said I'm happy to talk to anyone, but it depends what you mean by that. I mean, a sort of royal commission or sort of grand committee of parliament and things like that, I don't think that's going to get us anywhere. I mean, the Adair Turner process was set up by the Labour government. It had Jeannie Drake from the trade unions as the vice chair from memory, and it just went off and it came up with a set of proposals, and it came up with the earnings link, which at the time was a difficult Rubicon for the Labour government to cross, because Tony and Gordon had defined their modernisation of the Labour Party as being against the earnings link in the late 90s. There were ferocious debates at the Labour Party conference where Barbara Castle was standing up to berate Gordon Brown and Tony Blair for not going for the earnings link. So they crossed that Rubicon, and from where I was standing as a special advisor in the Treasury, if David, I think he's at the back, he might disagree with that. I think he was the shadow pension spokesperson for the Tories at the time. He might disagree with this, but it looked like by proposing an automatic opt-in for employees, that was the Tories crossing an equivalent Rubicon. That's what it looked like from our vantage point. David may disagree, but that was a separate body that came up with that. It wasn't a sort of royal commission or a sort of grand committee of parliament sort of thing. But both parties had to shift, is the point. And the question is, can an equivalent process pattern be found on social care, I suppose, on non-means tested social care?
Right, let's get one more round of questions and then get out into the day. So lady in the middle.
Hi, lots of you have spoken about the need for a kind of long-term solution. There was some mention in the slides of the potential for a consultation. I'm just wondering at this stage, what level of people you're expecting from Theresa May beyond the kind of headline percentage increase potentially? And also, I guess, Jonathan, you've already talked about it, but if there were to be a kind of more detailed proposal on the table, what level of potential is there for kind of parliamentary consensus on that?
Okay, let's get some others. Gentlemen.
Yeah, there's a long
What's your name,
term.
sir?
Jonah Doolittle. Andrew Dilnott produced the long-term social care report in 2008-2009, and it was a very sensible proposal which involved both the private sector and setting up an insurance sector that would actually cover the gap. Why won't you go back and look at that as an approach?
Fine, very good. And one more. Last question.
John Bryant. One of the obvious ways of increasing taxes is to increase the tax base. And one way of doing that, as we saw from the earlier diagram, is the generational problem that people who are above their retirement age stop paying national insurance. Now, for lots of people in this country, they don't even know that until you get to your nearly 60s and you realise, hey, you get a benefit if you carry on working after your retirement. Suddenly this national insurance stops. So why not have a cross-party agreement that the initial start to increase the tax base is the NHS tax for those above a retirement age who are earning more than the state pension, not just having taxes on private pensions, but all income over the statutory pension age, and you can have it at about 3 to 5%. You don't have to have the NHS, the actual rate currently, but if you start the process, older people, older workers will see the point that they're not paying for the NHS, but they're the ones who are going to benefit from it most in the future. And so we do need to increase the tax base, NHS tax for the older people, and you get round the problem about not increasing national insurance contributions because it's a different tax, it's a new tax. So you could get away with it even in the current Parliament.
We obviously agree with that. That was a core recommendation, a nit from Sarah. This is what we call it. This is the Peppa Pig chart.
Peppa Pig chart.
Now on, it's a bit Peppa Piggish. We're trying to bring. This is to bring. We're bringing policy making to the youth. Don't you start on dreadnoughts as well. On Andrew Dilnot, I mean, on the just briefly on the insurance sector. Others will have views on the wider Andrew Dilnot reforms, but I think this insurance sector thing is a made-up thing. As in, there's no. Every discussion for the last 20 years, people have said, "Oh, the insurance market is about to come in to provide social care insurance," and that is called a lie. They don't want to do it. There's huge they don't want to do it because of the huge correlated risk. In the countries that have done it, we've tried to do it in the 2000s. The Tories kind of started to talk into the sector in the last 5 years. They don't want in. They kind of say they want in because it's socially awkward to tell a politician no. But they basically do not want to bear that risk. And countries that are doing it, America, Australia, are now exiting the market because they've realised there's this huge downside risk. I'm afraid if you believe in, without sounding like a structural social democrat, if you believe in collectivising some of that risk, at some point you need to start doing it via the state. Anyway, what do you, let's use Laura's question as our key one, which is, what is Theresa May actually going to do you think? What are you actually expecting to happen? Just to give everyone a sneak peek.
Right, well, the answer is I don't know. I can tell you what I hope she'll do. I hope she'll go, as we've seen trailed in the Times today, she'll do something around the workforce and lifting the cap, because I think that's essential for her to do. But I also hope that she will do something that looks like 4% in the long term, but has to deal with social care as well. And it may be, and her proposal at the moment within the social care green paper is not only to separate it off from health, but to separate working age adults from older adults. That is a mistake in my view. And even if she has two processes side by side, they have to be joined at the hip so that we see a whole system approach. So that's my ask. It has to be recognisable and recognisably an amount that can make a difference, and it has to take a whole system view. And I think in order to get any of these measures through Parliament, it's going to require some cross-party working.
Jonathan, what do you think she's going to do? And will you sign up?
Oh gosh.
Let's have a guess.
I don't know. I do know that Jeremy Hunt has raised expectations. It looks like the Chancellor is trying to dampen expectations. What will she do? Who knows? I've sort of outlined some of the things that we're looking for on, 5% in the first year, dealing with staffing, dealing with social care. They cannot be separated out. Sarah is absolutely right on that. And actually also, this point I made at the end about these widening health inequalities, and it sort of comes to your point, sir, which we've not quite answered, is that, we're obviously talking about how to fund the NHS, but if you want to improve health of the population, you've got to look at the whole of public services and the whole of government expenditure.